In this lesson, we'll cover how to design using the Lumos Figma file. If your design is going to be built out in Webflow using the Lumos framework, this file provides a helpful starting point to promote consistency across Figma and Webflow. To create a new page, we'll select our style guide and hold the Option or Alt key and drag to the side to duplicate this, and we'll call this our home page. If we head over to components, we'll notice some components we can use to build a page. I'll select this one and hit Command C to copy. And then back over here, I'll select my page and hit Command V to paste. Then I can use my up and down arrow keys to move this section around. Now we'll notice this section is marked in purple. That means it's a component. I can change the text and images, but I can't change the design. So I can't reorganize elements or update the style. To do that, I'll need to right click on the component and under main component, hit go to main. And this will take us back to that component page where this main component is. And then if I make a structural or style change here, that'll update across every page that's using that component. So this is a great way to promote consistency. Now, if you need to unlink a component, you can right click and hit detach instance, and that allows us to make changes freely without affecting other instances of that component. Now you'll notice that I can select an element and use my left and right arrow keys to move side to side, select an element, use up and down to move up and down like so. And this is because this is built using auto layout. So with auto layout, if I change the font size, if I add more text, that's going to push the other elements in the other sections down. So this is usually how we want to work. It promotes consistency. Now, if you're going to have an element here, and maybe this element, I'm holding Option and dragging to duplicate, maybe this element isn't quite aligned here. If I hold Shift A, or if I press the Auto Layout button, either way, it's going to turn on Auto Layout, and now everything's perfectly aligned. I can duplicate elements to add them to this layout, and I can adjust the spacing between elements with this gap here, and use my arrow keys to move elements up and down. And when I change sizes, it moves elements around like so. If I were to remove auto layout from an element by pressing this button, now when I make changes here, it's not going to push the other elements around, and we can have elements running into each other, and we now can freely drag elements, but this is less than ideal. So usually it's preferred to use auto layout in most cases. If you're new to Figma and you're not too familiar with auto layout, there is this example section I've created here where you can use this to create your designs. So if I hold Option and drag, I'm duplicating this element here, and now I can freely move this element within this frame here. I can freely drag it around without worrying about auto layout, but the section here is set to auto layout. And this is important. This allows us so that if we resize the frame, it's going to push the other sections up or down, and it allows us to do things like change the style on the frame. These are things we wouldn't have access to if we weren't using auto layout. So if you're less familiar with Figma, I would still recommend at least using an auto layout section with just an open frame inside where you can freely drag things around. And when we're arranging things, it's best to keep things aligned to columns as much as possible. This helps when building out layouts in Webflow and making sure they're responsive to base our designs off of a column kind of design and layout there. So another thing we'll notice is we have variables to save all of our core styles. So for instance, for the section spacing here, I have things like my section spacing small. I can do space apart elements with section spacing main or large, or even page top if it's at the top of the page. And I can hit this toggle to adjust the bottom spacing and the top spacing independently. So we connect these all to variables so that if the client later asks us to tighten up all the spacing throughout the site, we can update these variables instead of going to every single section manually. Or if you want to update the top space on every first section on the page, you can just update this variable from one place instead of going to each section itself. So variables are what saves our core styles. Another thing we have for saving styles are our actual font styles. So here we have all of our different font styles. We can hit this to edit them, and we can also just select any element and apply any of these font styles to it like so. Now to edit any of these core styles, we'll want to deselect our page and head over to variables here. And then you'll usually see this side panel is closed. So we'll open that side panel. And then here we have our different groupings of variables, our collections. We'll start with the sizes collection, and I'll drag this out. So these are the core styles that make up our site. So we have things like this border width variable, for instance, and we'll notice that once I start updating this, it's updating the border width on this button, on this card, on this line. So variables are so helpful once you start designing to quickly test out different styles without having to manually apply those styles to a bunch of different elements. Same if I were to update this radius variable, notice how that's changing the radius on any different element where this style is applied. So I'm able to quickly just test out different styles in a really easy manner. And if you have multiple border widths throughout your site, you can always duplicate variables and create new ones. And we can define the value of these variables on both desktop and what their value should be on mobile. So we can update those styles across the board. Now here we have our site margin, and this affects the left and right space for all of our sections. So when I increase or decrease this, notice how it's adding and removing the left and right space. Usually you want to dial this in right at the start of your project so that if you have any manually positioned elements, you don't have to readjust them if you decide to change your margin. So usually this is one of the first things you want to dial in, and you can update its desktop and mobile value. And also we have the gutter here, which is our space between columns. So again, we can update that space here like so. And we can also update our core spacings here. So we have 8 core spacings. These are used to separate different elements. And these are fluid in Webflow so that they scale perfectly across all the different screen sizes. And we can just apply these spacings to different elements like so. So for instance, to separate this heading and paragraph, I went ahead and used this space 5. And to separate the paragraph from the button here, I went ahead and used this space 7. And to separate the 2 buttons here, I've gone ahead and used space 3. So it's best to pick some spacings to use in certain places and just use those consistently. So for instance, for these buttons, anywhere I'm going to have 2 buttons, for the most part, I'll go with space 3. If I want to override that in certain instances to make it smaller or larger, I can. But having a default value here is really helpful as your site grows, because whenever a client drops in a button group in Webflow, it'll have this automatic spacing applied. So it just promotes consistency and speed of workflow and everything like that. So these generic spacings are just used anywhere and everywhere that we need any kind of space here. We just space it apart with these different spacing variables. And so that if we tighten or loosen all this spacing throughout the site, it'll update everywhere we had space used. Now you can always reference these generic spacing variables through some more specific ones. So here I have the space 4, 5, 6, but let's say I want a more specific variable. I can create this and I can call this something like button group space. And so from here, I can choose any of the spacings in that spacing variable here. So this just gives me a little bit more freedom. So now anywhere that I have a button group, instead of just referencing the space 3 directly, I can go to that button group variable. And that way, if I need to replace that button group space with a different one later on, I can just edit that core button group variable, which I'll do right here. And when I do that, now it's going to update every single button group throughout the site instead of me having to go select each one manually. So if you have spacings that you're going to use in a lot of places, maybe to space apart a heading and paragraph, or buttons from the content block, whatever those core spacings are, using some named spacings like this can be really helpful to add even an extra layer of consistency, and it just gives some clarity and development of how you want those spacings to be used. So those are our core spacings to space apart elements. Then we have our section spacings to space apart sections. And if I were to edit, let's say this small spacing, for instance, or this main one, let's make it really small. Notice how that changed here for every section that was using that value. And I can increase or decrease it here. So if I later need to tighten or loosen all these main space or the large or the page top, I can do that from here as well. And then we have our font sizes here. So if I were to edit this H2 font size, for instance, I can increase or decrease its value here on desktop. And then I can also increase or decrease its value on mobile here as well. And that's how I can edit those font sizes. So to actually switch between desktop and mobile, what we can do is we can go ahead and duplicate this frame. I'll call this home mobile. And I'll go ahead and just drag the width of this frame in to make it a bit smaller. Maybe I want mobile to be something like this. Notice how the site margin is way too large, the font sizes are way too large, everything is. So what I can do with the frame selected is here under appearance, I can switch its sizes over to mobile. And that's going to change the font size, that'll change the spacings, that'll change literally everything that we would want to change. We can do from switching desktop to mobile, and that way we don't have to go replace all of those variables manually. This is especially helpful when dealing with components where you can't really override the variables. So using this switcher here is really helpful there. And we have another switcher as well, and that is to switch our themes. So for instance, if I switch this theme between light, dark, or even brand, I can switch the color not only of the section and the text, but also of different children like these buttons inside. So all sites at the very least will always have a light mode and a dark mode, even if your site is completely white. If there's ever a dark image and a button needs to appear on top of it, that would still be a dark mode instance. So the modes aren't always applied to an entire section. Sometimes they're just applied to a card or different elements. So it's important at the very least to have light mode and dark mode figured out for your site. Now we'll also look at our typography, and here what we'll notice for typography here is I can go ahead and select any of these elements and I can switch its style, H1, H2, and if I go ahead and edit that typography here, if I hit edit, I can change, we'll notice that its font size is linked over to that font size variable, so it can update on desktop and mobile. Its line height isn't connected to a variable because Figma variables don't allow us to use percent yet inside of variables. So this percentage is based on the font size, so that when the font size reduces, the percentage line height scales down automatically, and same goes for the letter spacing that is set with percent here. But you'll notice the font family and also the font weight is connected over to a variable as well. So if we open up our variable panel here and we head over to typography, we'll notice we have our primary family, and that's set here for all of these. We have our weights that we plan to use with that family. So if I were to have any kind of element here and I want it to detach this family and detach its weight, I can now kind of just freely look through my different fonts here and the weights available with that font. And then if I want to apply that, I could just go ahead and just type that name into here, and I'll go ahead and set the weights that I plan to use, in this case just regular. And notice when I changed that family name, it updated for all of the headings, all of the paragraphs, every single element is now using that family. Now, if I just want to apply that for headings, what I can do, I'll undo that, and I'll create a new string here, and I'll call this secondary family. And I'll go ahead and switch this over to that family. So I'll go instrument, serif, and we'll go ahead and set that here. And we'll go ahead and set the weight we plan to use with that. So I'll make that a string, and I'll call it secondary regular. So this is the weight that belongs to that new family I created. And I'll go ahead and switch that to regular. And we're keeping that separate from the primary family's weight, because if we need to update this, let's say we want to make all of these instrument fonts light, we can just rename this variable and this value here, and it'll only affect the weight we're using with this family instead of affecting every instance of regular weight used throughout the site. So we always want the family and the weights we plan to use with that family saved here. So now what I can do is I can head over to that display here, and I can switch it over to the secondary family, and then I'll switch it over to the secondary weight that I plan to use with that family. And I'll do the same thing for my H1 here, and secondary family and the secondary weight. And that way now if I change this, it's going to affect the weight and the family across both the display and the H1 and anywhere else that I decide to apply those variables. So that's it for the weights here. And then the other thing we'll want to look at is our colors. So if I head over to swatches here, these are all the core colors used throughout the site. So we have our light 100, which is pure white in this case. Light 200 is going to be a little bit darker. We have light 100 at opacity 20. So that's that light color at 20% opacity in case we want to use that for borders and different things. And I could duplicate this variable. I could create a light 200 at opacity 20 if I need it. I could create a light 300 where this is just going to be a little bit darker. And often the colors themselves don't even have to be completely neutral. So sometimes maybe they're all shades of a blue, and we'll make that a little bit darker each time. So we can use that there. And then maybe all of these dark colors are shades of kind of this, let's go kind of a bluish green. So maybe I dial that in here. So 900 is going to be our darkest color. Then I'm going to use that same color for the opacity version of 900. Then 800 is going to be just a little bit lighter. And then if I duplicate this and make a 700, it would be even lighter than the 800, like so. So that's how we can kind of dial in the colors there. And for the actual brand colors, these are the core colors. Brand 500 is the main color you'll have for your brand. And we can switch that over here to a color. Notice how that change we made here is going to take effect. Now 500 is the main one, but we'll often have a 400, which is going to be a little bit lighter. And then our 300 is even a little lighter than that. A 200 will make even lighter, and then 100 is even lighter. And then we'll also have 600, which is going to be a bit darker. And we can kind of dial that in like so. Now we also have brand text, and this is the text color we plan to use on top of that brand. So if I were to switch this over to light, for instance, notice how that affects the text color everywhere that text color appeared on top of the brand here. So if we need to change our brand color eventually to be something much darker, it probably would need light text. Or if we need to change it to be something much lighter, it would probably need dark text. So depending on the brand color that's used, we're able to switch the text color that's used with that brand from one place. And if we have multiple brand colors used throughout our site, we could create a brand 2, and I'll call this 500. So this is the main color for that. And I'll go ahead and switch that over to being kind of this blue here. And I'll go ahead and create a color variable here called brand2 text. And I'll go ahead and go to libraries and apply that light 100. So this is the text color I plan to use on top of this brand 2 color. And I can also duplicate this one if I want the tints and shades of that color to be used throughout. Now, once we start actually applying these colors, we can do that over here. So let's go ahead and switch this element here. We'll go ahead and switch its theme over to light. And let's go ahead and set this card here, the background color of it, over to theme background 2. So this is the second color within that background, and let's remove the border color from it for a minute. So this is kind of what we have here. And we'll notice if we head over to theme, we can affect what those core colors are inside both light mode, dark mode, and our brand mode. And we can also add new modes here if we'd like. So for instance, I might set the core background color of my site to being this light 200. And then I might set my secondary background color that I'm using for that card to be light 100. So now it's kind of white there. And then whenever I switch over to dark mode, the main background color becomes this dark color, and the secondary background color becomes this lighter green. So if I take this whole section and switch it to dark mode, and let's make sure that this card here, it's in light mode itself. So let's make sure it's auto, so it inherits from the mode of its parent. And so now we'll notice that we're able to switch between light mode and dark mode, and it's changing the primary and secondary background colors depending on the mode we're in. We also have this text color, which if I go ahead and switch that over to being maybe this orange here, whenever we're inside of light mode, then once I switch back to light mode, we'll notice all the text color now becomes this kind of orange color. And whenever we're in dark mode, the text color switches over to this white color. So we can really define what we want text color to be across each of the modes. We can even duplicate this if we want a text 2, and maybe this is used for our paragraphs. Maybe we want them to be a slightly faded color. We can use that and define what that secondary text color should be across each of the modes. And then also what our border colors should be. So this is the dark at the 20 opacity. This is light at 20 opacity. And this is brand text at 20 opacity for the brand mode. And then I kind of just apply those borders and use it on different elements. So for instance, on this element here, let's go ahead and just wrap it. So I'll hold Shift A to wrap it in an auto layout div, and then, or auto layout element. And so now I have this selected, and I'll go ahead and apply my space 4 to the sides. I'll apply space 4 to the top and bottoms, and then I'll go ahead and set a stroke here, and I'll apply for the stroke width. I want to attach that to my border width main. And then for the stroke color, I want to go ahead and attach that to the theme border color here. And then for the radius here, I'll go ahead and attach it to radius main, so it's rounded. And so now I have this element completely connected to variables, and that border width color is going to change depending on the mode of its parent element. So if you ever create a new frame, which often can happen, so if I drag out a new frame, we'll notice that it doesn't have any of those controls. What I want to do is, first of all, convert it to an auto layout. So I'll go ahead and toggle that, and still no controls for it yet. So then we just want to take any kind of element, like maybe this text element, and put it inside. And when we do, now we get these appearance controls to switch the theme and to switch the sizing and everything. And then we just want to apply, like for the fill of that, we want to make sure that's attached to the theme background, and the text color on this child is set to the theme text color. And that way it is completely switching once we switch over our different themes. So now that we have that set, we'll also want to control the style of individual children. So we'll notice, for instance, if I were to preview this, if I were to preview and scroll down here, we'll notice that this button here, it's going to hover white in this case, but in this case it's hovering dark. And if one of these cards was light, like let's switch this card over to, let's go ahead and switch it over to light mode. We'll notice that the same button that was hovering white here is actually going to hover dark here. So the hover color, the text color, and everything changes depending on the mode that the parent's in. And to set that up, what I usually recommend doing is start by just making kind of a frame here and attaching that over to your theme background like so. And then I would go ahead and make another frame here. And actually, let's set some text. We'll just hit some text and say get started, and then we'll go ahead and switch this over. We can apply a text style here. So we'll go main, let's go large, and then I'll do Shift A to wrap it in a layout. And I'll go ahead and just start applying some of these colors. So I might go brand 500, and then for the text color here, I might go ahead and switch that over to brand text. So that's set there. And then this is my main button here. What I would do is go ahead and apply a stroke. Let's give it the background color here, like so. And let's give it the stroke border width here. And now what I'll do is duplicate this and figure out what I want the hover state to be. So on top light mode, do I want the button to hover white like it can here, or do I want it to hover dark? So I'd figure that out using this. And then I'd go ahead and figure out what I want the text color to be when hover. And that's only for the primary button. Then we have our secondary button, which can be outlined, or it could be, the secondary button could be this white one if we want it. So I'll go ahead and just make it outlined. So the fill color here should be transparent. The border maybe can stay the brand color, and the text color can do something like this. And because the border is brand, usually whenever we fill it, we want it to fill in with whatever the border color was. So the border and that would change here, and then this text color would change here. So I just kind of plan out the hover states like this. So this is my primary button, and then when I hover, I want it to change to this. This is my secondary outline button. When I hover, I want it to change here. And then I just kind of duplicate this frame and then just switch out the theme. So in dark mode, what do I want to happen? Well, this still looks okay here, and this one actually works to here as well. So maybe I don't need to change much, or maybe I do actually want to change, since this was more of like a ghost it style on hover, maybe I do want to change this on hover to be the dark 800 like so. So that way it more closely matches what light mode was doing. And then what happens when all this is inside of brand mode, I'll need to change some of this. So basically just figuring out what your primary button style needs to be, both on hover and your outline button style across all of the different modes. And then once you have that planned out, you can head over to variables and then just start applying those different variables here. So if I'm saying that I know inside of light mode, which is right here, my primary button needs a brand background color. Notice though, if I switch that color, it's also changing the border here because the border is connected to that primary button background color unless I override it. So that way I'm not having to switch the border and the background. And then the text color can still stay brand text, so that's good. And then I'm saying whenever I hover this, I want it to switch to white. So background on hover, I'd go all the way up to the top to my core colors here, and I'd switch this over to light 100 because right now it's connected to the theme text. So it'll just be based on this text color. For instance, if I were to change this text color here, that's affecting the, if I go over here and I switch this over to light mode, that's affecting the text color, but it's also affecting the hover of the buttons because the button's background hover is connected to the theme text by default. So what I would want to do is just make sure that I want to switch this over to one of the core swatches. So in this case, I'm going to go light 100 and notice how the background, the border is still connected. And then I'll want to switch its text color over to being dark like that whenever I hover this button. So now I have this primary buttons hover inside light mode, and then I can scroll down to the secondary button and its border here, its background still transparent, its border, I might go ahead and switch. It's tempting to want to grab like another variable like this button primary background, but that can get messy. So I always want to go up to these core colors here and switch it here. So I'm connecting the border to that, and then its text color can stay dark. And in this case, I don't even want it to be it can stay theme text is fine. I don't want it to be brand text because that brand text could change. And then whenever we hover this, we want it to fill in with the brand, and then its text color can fill in with brand text, just in case we decide to change that brand later on. The text color is connected on hover. So once we have that set, that's the hover for the outline button inside light mode. And then I would just go ahead and switch this whole thing over to dark mode, and then just start updating this. Like the main thing we changed was on this primary button inside dark mode, we switched its hover color here we switched it over to this one so it felt more ghosted. And then its text color on hover we switch over to being light here, like so. And so we can make those updates there, but it's helpful, I think, before diving into the variable panel, which can feel a bit complex at first if you're not used to it. It's helpful to just kind of plan out your hovers and your states statically so you know what you're trying to do, and then jump into that variable panel, which will help with the theming and everything from there. Also, if we were to create a new text element, by default, it's going to have some extra spacing on it. Normally in Figma, this is how text elements look, but in Lumos Style Guide, all of them have this text trim turned on by default that removes that extra spacing, because otherwise, when we have this 40 spacing here, it will feel larger in Figma than it does in Webflow, because the text element has some default spacing, but in Webflow, that default spacing is cropped. So we want to make sure we're cropping it off in Figma too, so we're getting true numbers here for what we do. And anytime you apply one of these variables here or one of these styles, it's automatically going to have the text trim on by default, so you don't have to worry about that. And of course, we can always detach a style, and it'll still be connected to the font size. So if we edit the family or the weight or the font size for this display, it'll change for this one as well. But if we need to make overrides like changing the line height or the letter spacing in one-off instances, we can tweak different things, like tweak the weight or anything, while still leaving the rest of the styles connected here. So that allows us to override specific things. We'll also notice that if I select this or deselect, we have the grid guides here, and this is saved as a style. So if I configure it and I edit these guides, I can change the column count. Usually 12 is what we want. I can change the darkness of the overlay and the overlay color, and so that it's connected to the site margin and the gutter. So we can change that grid style, and because this is saved as a style, it's updating across every page here as well. So you could even duplicate a style and have a separate one for mobile grid guides if you want less columns there. But this is how you would start to use those styles to kind of build out your site in a scalable way. So I hope this crash course helped you in learning how to use the Lumos Figma style guide, and great luck with creating your design.